let's talk about the endocrine system. So the endocrine system is a communication system. It's similar to the nervous system in that it sends information from one part of the body to another. But what is different about the endocrine system is instead of using electrical impulses, it uses a chemical signal. And instead of communicating very quickly in this very hardwired fashion, like the nervous system, neurons are going to send information from point A to point B very quickly. The endocrine system works a lot slower, and it's a collection of glands that are able to take advantage of the bloodstream to get their message out to their target cells so that they can have influence. So I just want to draw some attention to some key endocrine organs that are specifically going to be relevant to our reproductive physiology conversation. We are not going to cover all of the hormones in the body, so use this lesson as your guide to kind of pick and choose what you're going to do in the readings this week. Right, whenever you're in your fundamentals of A&P book, you are free to skip the sections that we don't cover because there are a lot of hormones that do things not related to reproductive physiology. Okay, let's point out some of the big ones. So one of the best places to start is going to be up in the brain. All right, so we're going to have this little structure here called the hypothalamus, and dangling just beneath it is the pituitary gland. So the hypothalamus is kind of the bridge between neuronal communication and the endocrine, the chemical communication. And the little guy here, the pituitary that's dangling from the hypothalamus, okay, that is going to be called the master gland because there is a list of hormones that it is responsible for secreting and regulating. Okay, and that's not even the full list. Remember, I edited and I only picked up the ones that are important to us because we're studying the biology of sex. Okay, let's work our way a little bit further down the body and check out some of these other hormones that are of interest to us. Okay, the adrenal glands will get a brief mention, specifically when we start talking about reproductive senescence and aging. So as we get older, the testes start to decrease their testosterone production. The ovaries flat out stop producing estrogen at menopause, which is about age 50. So the adrenal gland, which people more think of as adrenaline, that fight or flight response, we have to look at kind of the other layers of those hormones because it becomes a very important secondary source for our sex hormones. Specifically, it's able to release androgens, which in the female body, we can convert some of those androgens into estrogens, and I'll show you how later in the lesson. Okay, we can't forget about our favorite organs, the testes and the ovaries, right? Those are obviously our gonads, and they have a whole host of hormones. So the testes, obviously going to produce androgens. Remember that word means man-forming, especially testosterone, but we can't forget about dihydrotestosterone, right? That was really important in the external genitalia development. We saw people with poivroses not having the enzyme to turn testosterone into dihydrotestosterone. That created problems for them in terms of how those structures developed. Okay. Inhibin is going to be a new one, and that's also secreted in the female system. Inhibin is going to inhibit things, and it's going to be part of a negative feedback loop, which we will clear up in a little bit. And then obviously the ovary is responsible for producing estrogens. See, there's an S on that word. There's going to be more than one type of estrogen, and then also progesterone, which we usually see in the late luteal phase of the ovarian cycle, and then all throughout pregnancy. It's our pregnancy hormone. So what is a hormone? Okay, I've talked a little bit about chemical signals. So that's what it is. It's a chemical messenger. It's going to provide an instruction to another cell. Hormones are produced locally in one specific cell type. And if we turn our attention to the figure, you'll see that there's a secreting cell here. And these little blue dots that it's making are going to be the hormones. And that hormone will be secreted from the gland or cell that it's produced in. And then what's really critical is it's going to take advantage of the bloodstream. Remember, like the nervous system, we don't have these hardwired neuronal cells that are going to move our electrical impulse. We have a chemical signal, so we can just put it in the blood and let the heart circulate, and eventually it'll get to where it's going. How does it know where it's going? Well, it doesn't. Okay, it's a little bit of luck here. Okay, the target cells are going to have receptors specific to a hormone. Okay, and they're going to be on the surface there. So the target cells are going to be the only cells that are able to respond to that hormone because of the receptor. You can think of hormones kind of like radio waves. Okay, the radio waves are kind of always out there, always happening, but you're only going to hear them if your radio's on and dialed into the proper station. So most cells are going to ignore those hormones. Okay, but if it's the ovary and that's a hormone that the ovary responds to, like follicle stimulating hormone, it's going to have a receptor and there will be a response. The other important thing to remember about hormones is they're usually produced in small quantities. We'll see that once we get this binding at the level of a target cell, things are going to happen inside the target cell that are going to amplify the signal. So let's take a look at that. There are two structural types of protein or hormones that we can have. They're either made of proteins and amino acids, or they're going to be made of fatty acids and cholesterol derivatives. So, proteins are the building blocks in our body. They are water soluble, so they're able to float around in the blood very freely. But where they're going to encounter a little bit of trouble is as they come in to meet a cell. This is the plasma membrane of the cell. And one thing that's important about the plasma membrane of the cell is it is created entirely by lipids. So we've got kind of an oil and water situation here when that water-soluble protein interacts with that lipid-based cell membrane layer. So what that hormone needs to do is to find a receptor that is on the cell surface, and it's going to need to fit like a lock and a key. So what's interesting about cell membranes is they're covered in receptors, but they're all going to be different shapes. So imagine this plasma membrane, it's got all of these different locks. The hormone that is the key needs to find the appropriate lock that it fits in. Okay, and let's just say we're using oxytocin as an example. It is a peptide hormone, so it's a couple amino acids strung together. It's going to find the specific oxytocin receptor on its cell surface, and then what it's able to do is communicate its message to the inside of the cell through something called a G protein. Now, you can skip some of the detailed reading in your book about G proteins, because this is the only time we're really going to talk about them. And we don't need to belabor that concept as we would in a general biology course. But for the sake of completeness, let's just say the G protein is then going to activate a downstream cell signaling cascade, which is going to result in some type of second messenger. And so if you think of the hormone being the first messenger, And then the second messenger is the one inside the cell, which is able to keep that message going. And basically what happens with peptide hormones is they typically open up ion channels. They're going to activate enzymes. Maybe they phosphorylate them. Maybe they dephosphorylate them. And that's going to get some sort of process going. Let's look at the fatty acid or cholesterol-derived hormones. Okay, so these are going to be, when people say steroids, they're thinking of a cholesterol-derived protein. And open your mind up a little bit. I think people hear steroid and they think of anabolic steroids like external sources of testosterone. Widen your perception a little bit. It's not just testosterone that is made out of this steroid typical ring-shaped structure. So there's usually 4 rings there. And that's how I can usually just quicken with my eye say, oh, that's a steroid hormone. Estrogen's going to have this shape. Progesterone's going to have this shape. There's going to be a lot of other things that are made in the adrenal gland that are this shape. So when you hear steroid hormone, think of a lot of sex and adrenal hormones. Don't just think of testosterone. That's limited and boring. These guys, because they're made of cholesterol and lipids, they have a harder time moving through the blood. They usually need some type of binding protein or buddy. So let's say this is a testosterone. There usually is some type of binding protein here. So we can call this androgen binding protein. Okay, and that will help carry that androgen in the blood, or maybe keep it locked in a certain place because it does have a challenge moving around there. But once we get to the plasma membrane, which is lipid-based, it's no longer oil and water, it's oil and oil. So come on in, steroid hormone, and it can zip past, and it doesn't have to waste time with a second messenger system. It's going to zip straight into the nucleus and find a spot on the DNA that it can bind to. So we say that these act more like transcription factors because they're going to go down to the level of the DNA and start transcribing a gene, which is really the first part of making a new protein. So these guys just cut right to the chase because they're able to come in a lot more easily. And once they find their way onto DNA, the gene gets activated. We make a copy of that gene in the form of mRNA, which is then able to leave the nucleus. The DNA can't. It's too. So a little bit of RNA, copy of that gene comes out, and then that gene will get translated into protein, and we'll make lots of proteins, whatever we were trying to make. Maybe it's more hormones, maybe it's something else. Okay, and that target cell will have its response. Okay, I want to say a little bit about hormone specificity. Remember at the beginning of the lecture, I said there would be estrogens. Okay, so there are multiple types of estrogens. So this is one of the best examples. So again, think of lock and key model. Now think if you copied a key at the hardware store and it fits the lock, but you really got to jiggle, you really got to work with it before you get the door open. And this is what we mean by specificity. So the estrogen that we typically talk about when we don't specify is estradiol. Okay, that one fits perfectly in the lock, turn the key every time, straight in. Okay. Now, there are these other less good keys like estriol and estrone. Estriol is more something that shows up during pregnancy. Estrone is obviously the weakest. It's only 1% effective. So think of these as poorly cut keys for estrogen that if you jiggle them enough, eventually you're going to get the door open, but you're going to struggle there for a while. Okay, and certainly there are couple different types of androgens. Like we said before, testosterone and dihydrotestosterone are going to be different things. Now, that being said, let's talk about the difference between natural hormones and synthetic hormones. So any type of those three estrogens or two androgens that you're able to produce are going to be called endogenous. Endo meaning within, right? They're generated, okay, in the person. Okay, so you make those. Now, synthetic hormones can be produced in a factory, or perhaps a plant is growing something that kind of looks like estrogen. Those are referred to as exogenous. So phytoestrogens are something that are produced in plants, specifically soy. And again, they're going to be shaped close enough to estrogen that they're going to fit into the log. And if you jiggle them enough, eventually they're going to open it up. Okay? And that's something to keep in mind. One thing that's really interesting is women of Eastern cultures typically don't go through as severe as a transition during menopause. So some of the unpleasant side effects of menopause are hot flashes, sweating, vaginal dryness, okay, a lot of these unpleasant things that happen as the ovaries are shutting down. And it's thought that because Eastern women have a more soy-rich diet, they're able to stave off some of these severe symptoms. Now, that incited a craze where menopausal women of the Western world started eating more soy products, and they were not getting that benefit. So the benefit appears to only take place if you have eaten soy along your entire lifespan. So something about getting those receptors upregulated early and often, not just at the moment when you need them the most. Xenoestrogens are a little bit scary. These are chemical-based, so something that's happened in a factory. And the most common ones that we often talk about are pesticides like DDT, and also plastics like BPA. So DDT was kind of the scare of the 70s in the US, and this was a pesticide that was commonly used, and it turned out that it does have some impact on the endocrine system, and your body does recognize and respond to that chemical. BPA is kind of more of a common now problem. So if you look, whenever you're purchasing things for children like baby bottles, a lot of them are listed as BPA free. I think people just really aren't taking any chances. We don't know if BPA is as bad as DDT, and in fact, I'm going to ask you that question on the discussion board this week, so you can get a little bit more information from the other materials that are posted, and go ahead and make an informed response. These Nalgene bottles everybody was drinking out of in the early 2000s seem to have lost popularity, or now the ingredients are kind of listed BPA free. If you're curious about a plastic, all you have to do is pick it up, flip it over. You'll see the little recycling symbol on the bottom. Let's see if I have anything in my office, right? So, you know, you'll see the little triangle there. And within that triangle is going to be some type of number, like 1 through 7. And you can look up and see which of those numbers possibly contain BPA and which don't, if you are concerned about them. Okay, so just a little bit more about DDT. So again, kind of what sparked the panic in the US is there was a spill of DDT, and some of the alligators started to feminize, both male and female, so that ends up being a bit of a problem, right? That was after a big spill, not common usage, but it was decided in the US that the risk outweighed the benefit of getting rid of the pests and keeping the crops healthy and keeping the mosquitoes from biting people. Now, if you go to Africa, where a mosquito won't just bite you and give you an itchy bump, it'll give you malaria, that's a place where the benefit might outweigh the risk. So there are other countries that do use DDT because they would rather risk, a possible spill, may or may not happen, that might feminize some species as opposed to getting a malaria, which will kill you. So again, that's going to vary from country to country, and those are things that you can debate on the discussion board. Other fact out there, since 1992, the discovery is that there's been like a worldwide decline in sperm count. And xenoestrogens and then endocrine disruptors, that's a new word. Again, something that can affect our endocrine system, from the environment. Those have been examined. There's really nothing conclusive. And again, I often ask the question, well, are we just getting better data? Are we just counting more people's sperm and we didn't really have a good basis for comparison? I don't know. Breast cancer incidence has increased in women in industrialized countries. Again, is it because now everyone gets mammograms and before 1940s, no one got mammograms and now we're able to detect it? Maybe your ancestors were dying of breast cancer and you didn't know. You just said death unknown. Or is it that perhaps there's some DDT or DDE, the metabolite of DDT, building up in our bodies from a, lifelong diet of consuming vegetables and things that were treated with that? We don't know. Okay, I'm going to stop there and we'll come back to this slide next time.